NPV, last time we talked about it, and we said that it's the sum of all the present values of the future cash flows, where cash flows out are negative, cash flows in are positive. And we said that we accept all net present value projects greater than 0. In theory, that's correct. But what did we say about in reality? Yeah, use some common sense. If it's $1,500 on a $5,000 investment, great. If it's $1,500 on a $1 billion investment, whew, I don't think so, right? And we said it's not good to do NPV 0 projects because basically you're not gaining anything, but they do require effort and there's risk. And then finally we said about negative NPV projects. Theoretically, we never accept negative NPV projects, but on occasion we must. What kind of projects would they be?
Things that involve government laws and regulations.
Yeah, when the government tells you to do something, so for instance, environmental or safety, you pretty much have to do it because if you don't, what are they going to do?
Shut you down.
They're going to shut you down, and then so all your other cash flows will disappear. And so that's the way the government turns that into a positive NPV project, because if you don't do it, they're going to take away all your positive cash flows. Okay, and remember that this rule for net present value comes from the goal of financial management. What's the goal of financial management? Maximize shareholder wealth. Now, one of the things I want to point out here is that this rule has an implicit assumption. And that implicit assumption is that there is always money available. If you've got a positive NPV project, you can find people to invest. That's an implicit assumption here. And we're going to see that that is not always the case. Any questions? Okay, so let's talk about what's needed for NPV. We need the initial investment amount. We need the future cash flows and their timing. And we need a discount rate that's appropriate to the risk of the future cash flows. So that last chapter, Chapter 12, was all about finding that discount rate that is appropriate to the risk of those future cash flows. So here's a really lame NPV example. We're going to invest, we've got $100. We can either invest the cash today and pay a dividend of 107 in 1 year from today, or we can pay out a dividend of $100 today. So their choices, the investor's choices, are either $100 today or 107 1 year from now. Our investors can earn 6% on their money. What's the NPV of investing this cash? Basically, we're saying negative 100 if we invest it. That's a cash outflow. At the end, we'd have positive 107, but we have to find the present value of that. That's why we're dividing by 1 plus r to the first power. And we see that the NPV of that project is 94 cents. Do we accept or reject? We accept it, right? And here's another thought. If we had 94 shares outstanding, what should happen to our share price as a result of accepting this project? It should go up by, Mr. Murs, how much? By what? Okay, but I said there are 94 shares outstanding. 0.94 divided by, I'm trying to make math real easy here. Divide by 94 shares.
It's decrease by 4.
Decrease? That's positive. Right? That's positive. And so a positive NPV project increases shareholder wealth. By how much? 94 cents. How many shares do we have? 94. How much? Mr. Ali. 94 cents divided by 94 shares is how much?
Just that was 0.001, I think.
You used your calculator for that.
Yeah.
Oh, you're breaking my heart. Okay, yes, he's absolutely right. It's a penny a share. And so that's what we see. If a company accepts a positive NPV project, divide by the number of shares, it tells you what should be the impact on the share price. Now, it's kind of a nice check on your NPV. So you do the NPV and you see that it's supposed to be 10 million bucks or whatever. You accept the project and your share price goes up, but not by the expected amount. What does that mean? It means possibly that your estimation of this NPV is wrong. What if you announce that you're taking on a project that you think is positive NPV and the share price actually goes down? What does the market think about the NPV of that project?
It's
negative, right? I'll give you an example. You guys know about Facebook? Your grandma's probably on it. Facebook recently, Mark Zuckerberg announced that he was doing this thing called Meta, and we were all going to be going around with these ridiculous goggles on our head, and none of us would ever have to actually interact with a filthy human being again because we were all going to do it all in virtual reality. What happened to the share price? Straight into the toilet, right? That was the market letting Mark know that we don't want to walk around with ridiculous goggles on our head, that we do enjoy interacting with filthy human beings. Does that make sense? Okay, questions? So we've got these 3 questions that we said we have to ask about every investment criteria. And we are going to award 1 star for every question we can answer yes. And 3 stars is the most. It's not Amazon, there aren't 5 stars, there are only 3. 3 stars here. So the first question is, does NPV account for the time value of money?
Yeah.
Yes, how?
I don't know.
You don't know? Okay, your instinct's correct though, it does. Remember the definition of NPV. It's the sum of the present values of all this stuff, right? And so that's how it's doing it. We're taking the present value of all this stuff. And so we are accounting for the time value of money. So 1 star so far. Does it account for the riskiness of the cash flows?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Do you know why this time? Okay. Mr. Merce, why?
Because it's discounted at the rate.
Yeah, remember that discount rate we came up with that is according to the risk of the project? When we discount by that rate, we are accounting for the risk. So, 2 stars so far. And finally, does it provide information regarding the wealth created by the project?
Yes.
Yes. Do you know how? Her instincts are amazing. Okay, so let's ask Ms. Knight. How does NPV tell us information about the wealth created by the project?
Well, if you end with positive,
If you end with a positive, when you know we are creating wealth, but we know something beyond the creating, destroying. We know how much. It gives us a dollars and cents value of how much wealth is being created. Now, of course, it's a swag, right? That's all we can do in this world, are swags, anything involved in the future. Okay, so that means that we can say yes to all 3 of these questions. That means that NPV is a 3-star measure, and there are only 3 stars available, so that makes NPV our gold standard. Now, we say down here at the bottom, NPV works every time. That's true, except, have you ever heard of the computer concept of garbage in, garbage out? If you throw garbage into NPV, you're going to get garbage out. And so if your numbers and your assumptions are valid, then NPV works every time. But keep in mind, it's still just an expected value. It's like a forecast. Things could go terribly wrong. So for instance, there were a lot of projects like, let's put together a new casual dining establishment, and we're going to open on New Year's Eve 2019. Positive NPV project, everybody comes in, we're having a good time, and then what happens March 13th of 2020? Yeah, whew, everything shuts down. NPV analysis was correct, right? But it gives you the expected value based on your assumptions. And the assumption was we weren't going to have a freaking worldwide pandemic, right? So even if you come up with a good NPV analysis, that thing is still just an expected value because there is a whole world of risk out there that we can't necessarily control for. Questions? Okay, now we're going to go from the most difficult measure to the simplest one. This one's called the payback period. And the payback period is simply the amount of time that passes before the project breaks even. And what does break even mean? It means it earns back the same number of dollars that we initially invested. It earns back the same number of dollars that we initially invested. And so our rule is to accept all projects that pay back on or before an arbitrary cutoff. What does arbitrary mean? Is it determined through a rigorous scientific method? No. It's a number that someone comes up with. You might say they pull it out of thin air. If you're less charitable, you might say they pull it from somewhere else. But people tend to think that arbitrary and random are the same here, and they're really not. So let me tell you about the situation I got involved in. I went to work at Halliburton in 1994, and there was a guy in charge of manufacturing there named Ed Phipps. And if you've ever had an MRI, then you have interacted with one of Ed Phipps's deals, because he was the one that brought the MRI to market for General Electric. He had been working in manufacturing for like 25 years by the time I started interacting with him. And he gave us the payback. He told us everything had to pay back in 2 years or less. Now, do you think he just settled on 2 years just without any thought at all? No, he had 25 years of experience. He had his instinct. His role's got really sharp instincts, right? Mm-hmm. But do you think Ed could have told me why 2 years? Probably not. But he knew it was, for our situation, the right number. Does that make sense? Okay, so this isn't just a matter of you guys getting out your Dungeons and Dragons 31-sided die and rolling it and picking a number. No, we're not doing that. This is based on your previous experience. Okay. So let's talk about how we go about this. Well, we need some stuff to do it. We need the initial investment amount. Is that the same thing we need? One of the things we need for MPV? Yeah. We need the future cash flows and their timing. Is that something we needed for MPV? Yeah, so far, same. But here we need this arbitrary cutoff, and we're gonna do it in years. What are we not required to have here? What was the third thing we had to have for NPV?
The wealth reporting?
Oh, nope. So the third ingredient.
Information regarding the wealth created by the project.
The third ingredient.
Discount rate.
Very good. Discount rate that's according to the risk. We don't need that here. So let's take a look at an example. And when I throw one of these at you, I will give you the first two columns. Let me say that again. When I throw one of these at you, I will give you the first two columns. My advice to you is create the third column. Create the third column. So how are we going to work this out? Well, our initial cash flow, we're going to do this basically like a negative checkbook. So you can think of a checkbook where you put $50,000 in and then you start writing checks out of it, and eventually the balance is going to hit zero. Here we've got a negative checkbook where we start out in the hole, $50,000. And now we're going to start making deposits, and we're going to keep putting those deposits in, and we're going to see when that balance hits zero. And at the time that it hits zero, that is the break-even period. Okay, so here we go. The initial investment, $50,000, so that means our initial balance is minus $50,000. Have we broken even yet? No, we're deeply in the hole. Time period one, we received $30,000 in cash flow. I add that to my negative $50,000, and so negative $50,000 plus $30,000 gives me minus $20,000. Have we broken even yet? No. In time period two, we received $20,000. We add it to our negative $20,000 balance, and what do we get? Zero. And have we broken even? Yeah. So what is our payback length of time here?
2 years.
Yeah, 2 years. Now, what was the rule? Our arbitrary cutoff is 2 years. What's the rule? Accept all that payoff on or before, right? This thing pays off exactly on the arbitrary cutoff. Would we accept it?
Yes.
Absolutely we do. Okay, now that's pretty simple. But numbers are not always that clean. I can tell you another story from Halliburton. Engineers, by the way, engineers love new machines, right? We love new projects, new things. And so what we would do is we would work with the vendor to figure out what it is we needed to do, the thing we needed to do. And occasionally you got to ride on a little private plane down to their showroom, and it was kind of fun. And then we'd say, okay, how much is this gonna cost? And they'd say $50,000. And we'd say, okay. Is that good business? No, we were just taking the first number they threw out. What's the first number they throw out? That's the absolute most you're gonna pay. But if someone is a skillful negotiator, they can probably get it for less. And so our plant manager figured this out, what we were doing, and he's like, you dumbasses. He says, we have a procurement department here. What is procurement? Yeah, they purchase raw materials, and do you think they do negotiations for those? Oh yeah. And so he said we needed to have our lead negotiator talk to this vendor about the machine. I'm not kidding, this woman's name was Rainey Dingle. And she was just the nicest person you'd ever meet until you got her in a conference room with a vendor. And then she was hard as nails. And she would get them in there and she would negotiate down the price. Now, in this case, let's say she negotiated them down $10,000. And so the initial cost for the company is gonna be $10,000 less. That is a savings of $10,000 of the shareholders' dollars. And so that's in accordance with our goal of financial management. But it makes the math so much harder here. So we start out with $40,000 in the hole. Year one, we have plus 30,000. How much is the balance now?
10,000.
Negative 10,000. Have I broken even yet? No. Next year we receive $20,000. What's 20,000 plus negative 10,000? Positive 10,000. Have I broken even yet? Yeah, we've more than broken even. Does that make sense? And so the breaking even happened between year one and year two. So, you think it's going to be good enough on a multiple choice to say, it's going to be somewhere between 1 and 2? Mr. Ali is hoping so, but the answer is no. Okay, so what do? Well, we're going to figure out some sort of decimal. But first we're going to have to make an assumption. And that assumption is that the 20,000 in year two is received uniformly throughout the year. That's our first assumption, that 20,000 is received uniformly throughout the year. My instinct tells me that it's not. Because as cash flow is going down, 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 my guess is we'll receive more money in the first half of the year and less money in the second half of the year, but I don't have any data to back that up, so we're just going to assume that it's uniform throughout the year. So, now let's see how we figure this out. We start with the year number of the last year with a negative balance. What year up here is the last one with a negative balance? 1. So we're going to start with a 1. I have to go ahead and write this up here. Plus. Now we're going to add the remaining balance divided by the next year's cash flow. But in this case, it's the amount we owe. The remaining balance is 10,000. So I'm going to write 10,000 here, not negative 10,000. And think of this as we still owe 10,000 bucks. And then how much is the next year's cash flow? So the next year after year 1 is year 2. What's the cash flow from year 2? 20,000, right? What is 10,000 divided by 20,000?
0.5.
0.5. And so our payback period is 1.5 years. And so there's your answer. Now, the question is this. Do we accept or reject the project? The cutoff's the same. We accept it, right? Because it actually pays back before the cutoff. Does that make sense? Okay, so far so good. Yeah.
So, if it had a payback period, a period cost, let's say 2 years.
If it's exactly 2 years, we're fine.
Okay, still in second,
But if it's 2.1,
then you reject it.
Yep.
Gotcha.
good question. Other questions? Because the rule is we accept all projects that pay back on or before. What is that noise? Can you guys hear that? You think the projector's dying? We gotta get through this fast. Projector's gonna die. Okay, here we go. So let's give it the stink test. The 3 stars. Number 1, does it account for the time value of money? Not really. I'll prove it to you here in a little bit, but no, it doesn't. By the way, I can tell you with certainty that it does not. Did we calculate any single present value here? No. Number 2, does it account for the riskiness of the cash flows? No. If it did, we would have had some sort of discount rate according to the risk, but we don't. And number 3, does it provide information regarding the wealth created by the project? No, I can set up 2 different scenarios with 2 different discount rates that would make this thing both positive, one would be positive NPV, one would be negative NPV. Totally depends on the discount rate. And so basically, we say this is a 0-star rule, 0 stars. And you're thinking, wow, that's a total piece of garbage. But wait, there's more. So let's go in detail about that first problem that I mentioned that doesn't account for the time value of money. I can prove it to you. Look at projects A and B. They both pay back in exactly 3 years. But which one would you rather have? Trust your greedy little heart. Which one would you rather have?
C.
C! No, I'm asking about A and B.
Oh.
You're getting ahead of me.
Sorry.
You'd rather have less money up front and more money later? Look at A and B. They're both paying off at exactly 3 years. But with A, how long do you have to wait to get that big juicy 50? 3 years. When do you get the big juicy 50 with project B? 1 year, right? And we know, and like I said, trust your greedy little heart. When would you rather have 50? 1 year from now or 3 years from now? Yeah. Okay, so that's the first problem, that we're not accounting for time value of money. And the second is that we're not accounting for cash flows after payback. Cash flows after payback. So look at B and C. The cash flows up to and including payback are identical. If we were to look purely at the payback for the project, what would we care which one of these we got? They're exactly the same, right? Which one would you rather have, Ms. Rolfe?
C.
C, why?
I don't know, I just see that big 60,000.
Yeah, she sees a big honking $60,000 hanging out there in year 4. Now, I've taught this class before where I had people who actually do this kind of stuff for a living in my class, and they call bullshit. They say, I've never seen a set of cash flows that look like that. And I say, you're absolutely right. But I have seen this. I have seen cash flows where one of them ends after 4 years, but then the other one, that 60, just keeps repeating year after year after year. So a 60 that keeps repeating on to the end of time, would that be more valuable than a 60 that stops after 4 years? Absolutely it would be. And so even without going to some sort of crazy extreme here, we know that the cash flows after the payback time are valuable. They are valuable. Now, each dollar is less valuable the further out you go, but they too still have value. Does that make sense? Okay, so the big problems here, we're not accounting for the time value of money, we're not accounting for the risk of the cash flows, we don't know if we're creating wealth or not, and it's not considering the cash flows after the payback. So there are 4 problems with the payback method. So you say, wait a minute, this thing is a total piece of crap. Why would we use it at all? Well, it's pretty simple. And for small projects, it might be sufficient. By the way, did we have to use the time value of money functions on our TI-BA 2 Plus to be able to do payback? No. So I will tell you about a situation where I used payback. I was working in Duncan, Oklahoma. We were making parts for pumps. And one of the parts for the pump was a brass ring. And it takes a lot of these brass rings to create the cylinder that this thing slides. Well, anyway, long story, you got to have these brass rings. And the way you make the brass rings is you put them on a bar stock of brass onto a lathe. A lathe is something that makes round things. And you carve out the inside of that brass, and you carve out the outside of the brass so that the outside diameter and the inside diameter match the ring you're trying to make. And then after that, you use something called a cutoff tool, and you cut these rings off one at a time from this tube that you've made. And the guy, his name was Ronnie, he stood there with a hook, and he would catch the rings as they would fall off. Because brass is soft, you don't want to damage anything. And then he would set it into this big bin. This is all he did all day long. And then of course, as soon as the tube's gone, he changes out, makes a new tube, and he starts all over again. It's all the man did all day long. Can you imagine? I mean, his right arm's pretty big. Okay, now, brass rings. Where do they go from there? Have you ever, when you trim your fingernails, have you ever noticed that you get these sharp things? And what do you have to do to keep from being able to, from injuring yourself and other people? What have you got to do then? Yeah, you got to file them down, right? And it turns out when you cut metal, exactly the same things happen. You get these things called burrs. So anytime you cut metal, you're going to end up with a sharp edge. And there are two problems with the sharp edge. Number one, it interferes with the operation of the pump. Number two, people can get injured installing and removing the part. And so we had to send these things to basically a filing operation called deburring. We had a man named Ralph who would sit on a stool all day long, and all he would do is take what we called a buzz gun, which is an air-powered tool with a flappy piece of sandpaper on it, and he'd go one at a time. And so when Ronnie would get done filling a bin, he would bring it to Ralph, and Ralph wasn't going to do that. We were paying Ralph $40,000 a year, and folks, that was back when $40,000 a year was some real money. We were paying him $40,000 a year to do this. Okay, one day, Ronnie flags me over to his machine. He says, I've got an idea. I said, ooh, I love ideas. What's your idea? He says, what if we could get one of those big vibrating bins that has the ceramic like pebbles in it, and you put the soap and the abrasive in it. He says, and when I get a ring off the machine, I can just toss it in there, and then they can sit there and vibrate while I'm running the machine, and then at the end, we just pull them out and they're already deburred, and you can fire Ralph. Now there's some background here. Ronnie hated Ralph. Ralph had made a pass at Ronnie's wife. Now, Ronnie's a smart man. He knows that his wife will not leave him for someone who doesn't have a job. So what's he gonna do? He's gonna get Ralph unemployed. Does that make sense? I mean, smart guy, right? Okay, now, so roll back to 1994. We've got just the very beginning of the World Wide Web. We don't really have the ability to go out and look at things online. There's no Amazon. So what do? We had this big yellow book called the McMaster Car Catalog, and I pull it out, and Ronnie and I sit down and we go through and we add up every single thing that we're gonna need to do this project. And it all comes up to like $1,500 or so. Of course, keep in mind that was a lot more money then. $1,500. And so, should we do an NPV analysis for this $1,500 project? No. There's nothing really crazy going on here. Payback's perfectly good. Ed Phipps has told us that we've got, if it pays back within 2 years or less, we're perfectly fine. The next thing to think about is that, well, we'll get to that in a minute. But Ronnie, do you think Ronnie knows how to do time value of money? No. But do you think he understands this? Absolutely. Okay, so what we did, we went ahead and figured this out. And by the way, $1,500 is an initial investment and the yearly cash flow is over $40,000. What do you think the answer is? Absolutely, we're gonna do that. Absolutely, we're gonna do that. So we order the stuff, we get it in, we install it, it runs, and it's perfect. It actually does a better job than Ralph ever could do. And Ronnie's just smiling ear to ear. He's like, when are you gonna fire Ralph? When are you gonna fire Ralph? I said, Ronnie, I've got some great news. He says, what's that? I said, we had a retirement in another part of the plant, and Ralph's just gonna go over there, but you still saved the business unit over $40,000 a year, so you have our gratitude. How do you think Ronnie felt about that? Yeah, I'm pretty sure if I still lived in Oklahoma, he'd still be shooting out my porch light every New Year's Eve, using the fireworks as cover. Do you think he actually ever shot my porch light out? No, but I'm pretty sure he wanted to. Back to the story. You see that it's a small project, it's simple, and the people on the shop floor can do this kind of thing. And by the way, lots of the best ideas at organizations, especially for small improvements, they come from people who don't know how to do time value of money. So Payback, perfectly lovely tool for that. Now, often leads to the same conclusion as NPV. Certainly, in the story with Ralph and Ronnie, it would have led to exactly the same conclusion. And it's good for firms with scarce capital and lots of growth opportunities. Now, when I first went to Halliburton, remember I told you we had the 2-year payback. I had lots of projects that would have paid back in like 2.5, 3 years, and they kept telling me no. And here's why. The company had been so poorly managed that nobody was willing to buy our bonds, no one was willing to buy our stock. Do you remember earlier that I said NPV assumes that you're always going to have in cash if it's a positive NPV project? It's not always true. And so this is one of the situations where it's not. So we had what's called scarce capital. We did not have enough capital to invest in all of our positive NPV projects. Now, notice it also says lots of growth opportunities. Our opportunities were not for growth at that time. Our opportunities were for cost savings. And by the way, saving $100 is the same as getting an additional $100. Does that make sense? So let's assume you're making $1,000 a month and your rent is $500, and so after that you've got $500 left. What if you could negotiate your rent down to $400? That extra $100, where does it go? It goes into your pocket. And so we had lots of opportunities for cost savings because once again the company had been poorly ran for a very long time. Now, after we got through all the projects that pay back in 2 years or less, what do you think happens? Now we raise the bar to 3 years, right? And in fact, this is all about getting your low-hanging fruit. If you've never heard this expression, you will once you get into business. You go to visit your grandfather. Your grandfather's a great man. He has planted an apple orchard in his backyard over a lifetime. It's a beautiful apple orchard, but he's old now and he can't get any apples for himself. So you go to visit him and he says, hey, would you go out to the orchard and pick one for me? And you say, no problem, and you go out there. Now, my question to you is this. Do you pick ones from the bottom branches, or do you get the big old ladder out and go for the one at the top? Yeah, you go for the lowest hanging fruit. And then you hear your grandmother yelling, bring me one too. What do you gotta do now? Well, you've already picked the lowest hanging fruit. What do? You go for one slightly up. And so projects that pay back like the one that I was talking about with Ronnie, that's low hanging fruit, right? You're gonna attack that first because you get the biggest benefit for your effort and your time and your money. Does that make sense? And so that's what this payback does, is it pushes us into identifying the low hanging fruit. And what that does is good, because if it's good to get a payback soon, because then what can we do when we get that money back? Yeah, we can invest it in the next lowest hanging fruit. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, it also provides quicker feedback on managerial decision making. And that thing down at the bottom we refer to as a hockey stick diagram. I think we actually have a hockey player in here.
Ex-hockey player.
Ex-hockey player. Okay, well, you still know what a stick is, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Can you explain to us why that looks like, why we would call that a hockey stick diagram?
Because it's curved, I guess.
Yeah, so hockey stick looks kind of like this. Do you see the hockey stickedness of it? Hockey stickedness is a word, look it up. That's why we call this a hockey stick diagram. Now, what does a hockey stick diagram say? Hockey stick diagram says, oh, well, your payback, your cash flows are going to be low at the beginning, but then they're just going to take off. Anytime you see something like that, I want you to immediately think in your head, bullshit. How often do you see something like this? You're going to go out, we're going to go out and install a new machine, and then after 3 years, it's going to start saving us even more money. Right? It doesn't make any sense. And so why would Payback prevent this kind of, by the way, why are they giving us this kind of set of cash flows? Because from an NPV perspective, if I make those future cash flows large enough, I can force it to a positive NPV. Did you know people are scumbags? Yeah. Do you think people want their projects to be accepted? Yeah, if your projects are continuously rejected, I've got a good project of my own, and that's to fire you, right? And so people want their projects to be accepted. And so what they'll do is they'll fake up these future cash flows to make the NPV positive. And you say, wait a minute, won't it eventually catch up to them? Only if they hang around. What's the average amount of time an American manager spends in a job? 3 years, 5 years? Maybe they'll catch you, maybe they won't before you put this on your resume and move on to the next job, right? Does that make sense? So the payback kind of prevents this kind of hinky behavior. I actually saw this guy I work with named Dan. Dan, his projects all look like this. I'm like, Dan, do you really expect this to work? He's like, hell no. I said, then what are you doing? He says, first of all, nobody here follows up. And he was right. Nobody at that company followed up to see if your projects actually produced the cash flows that they said they were going to. Dumb. Number two, he says, even if they do figure it out, I'll be gone by then. Two things wrong with Dan's plan. Number one, immediately, like 15 days after that, the word came out. They're going to start auditing the cash flows of our projects. Dan turns a shade of red because he knows things are going to come down the road. Here's the other thing. Dan's still there. Last time I looked at him on LinkedIn, Dan's been there. That's been like 30 years ago, 20, 30 years ago. Okay, so don't do this yourself, but be able to recognize that this is a sign of scumbaggery. Now, is it absolutely always scumbaggery? And the answer is no. I was giving the same talk to a group of China EMBAs that we had trained here at the university. And this particular group worked in the iron and steel industry in China. And when I said this is always a sign of lying, they all gasped. I said, what? And they said, that's what all our projects look like. And I said, all your engineers are liars. And they're like, no, no, no. Here's how it works. When we start up a new steel mill, the Germans and the Japanese require us to have 3 years worth of production records to prove that we have stable processes before they will buy the steel for the cars that they're building in China. They said until that time, we can only sell the steel to the native Chinese companies like Geely and Chery and BYD. And so they say for the first 3 years, we've got lower volumes because we're only selling to the Chinese domestic automakers. But then if we pass the quality control stuff, which we always do, then we can start selling to the Germans and the Japanese, and the amounts start to go up. I said, okay, thank you. You've given me one example of where this can be true. So if you see one of these, always ask someone, why do you expect those cash flows to look like that? Typically, they're not going to have a good answer. Questions? Okay, now let's talk about discounted payback. Remember that we said that payback was, it didn't answer any of the three questions, right? And there are some people who say, well, wait a minute, we can, if we would get a discount rate, we could just find the present value of those future cash flows, and instead of using the nominal cash flows, use the present values, and we would therefore have something that accounts for the time value of money and that accounts for the riskiness. Now, I'm going to make two arguments against that. Number one, it still ignores the cash flows beyond the payback. And number two, it requires exactly the same ingredients as NPV. And remember, we said NPV is the gold standard. If I've got enough information to calculate NPV, why wouldn't I? Why wouldn't I do that? And so my answer to you is discounted payback is a dog with fleas. I hate this thing. And it requires an arbitrary cutoff, which we really don't need because we've got the ingredients to do NPV. It reminds me of a dish my mother used to make. She would take crackers, eggs, and hamburger, and ketchup. And these are things that I always enjoy by themselves. But then she would mix them together in this lump and cook it in the oven. What's it called? Meatloaf. Now, raise your hand if you're a meatloaf lover. Yeah, I was gonna say there's always at least one, usually two. This is a small class. And after class, you're gonna say, you just haven't had it right. You gotta try my mom's meatloaf. And I'm gonna say no thanks. Okay, back to the story. This thing is meatloaf. It's like taking wonderful ingredients and turning them into crap. So don't do that. Don't do that. And for you, think of something else where you take wonderful ingredients and turn it into crap, and then you can give that. So as long as you can remember to be able to give this meatloaf speech to your boss when they ask you to give discounted payback, then I won't require you to learn how to do it or to use it on the exam or homework. Is that a deal? Okay. It's total crap. Now let's talk about average accounting return. There's only one thing that accountants love more than numbers, and that's words. And here we go. The average accounting return is equal to the average project earnings after taxes and depreciation divided by the average book value of the investment over its life. Now, we in finance say, wait a minute, isn't that top part just average net income? And they say, yeah. And we say, isn't the bottom part just average book value? And they say, yeah. So which of these should you have on your note sheet? Well, bottom one.
Both.
Both? Why would you do that? Maybe if you were in an accounting class, maybe. Okay, so what do you need? We need projected accounting earnings. And remember, accounting earnings are not real cash flows. That's a great question I could ask on an exam. I could ask, what measure doesn't account for this, this, and this, and doesn't use real cash flows? And the hint that I'm asking about an average accounting return is that it doesn't use real cash flows. Okay, so you need these projected accounting earnings, you need the investment amount, and a depreciation schedule. Why on earth do we need a depreciation schedule? Well, first of all, you had to have it to figure out the earnings. And secondly, book value is equal to historical costs minus accumulated depreciation. In order to know what the depreciation is, we have to have that depreciation schedule. And then finally, we have to have a minimum acceptable AAR, another arbitrary cutoff. This time, instead of coming from, say, a manufacturing person, the minimum acceptable cutoff comes from an accountant, probably the controller, whichever way you want to pronounce that, of the company. They're going to be the ones to provide this. And so the rule is this: we accept all projects with AAR greater than or equal to this minimum arbitrary AAR. Notice that greater than or equal to. It's similar to the payback on or before, right? Okay, so let's take a look here at an example. We have a 5-year project, and we have net income for each year. So they've already figured that out for us. And then we have, they don't tell us what is the average book value, but we know the book value is equal to historical cost minus accumulated depreciation. If this were a problem, I would tell you up front that the initial or the historical cost was 500,000. I would tell you the historical cost was 500,000, but I can kind of intuit that it is. I think we've straight line depreciated this thing to zero. Look at depreciation. We've got 5 $100,000 cash flows. So that would tell me, if I didn't know anything else, that would tell me it's probably a $500,000 initial investment. At time zero, there's no depreciation, so what's the book value then? 500,000 minus zero is 500,000. What's the book value at the next time period? 500,000 minus 100,000 is 400,000. And we have another depreciation of 100,000. Now we're down to 300,000. Then we're down to 200,000. We're down to 100,000. And at the end, we are down to zero because it is straight line to zero depreciation. Now, when I do these averages on the average net income, I'm going to divide by 5 because there are 5 years of net income. When I do the average book value, I'm dividing by 6. Any ideas why?
N plus 1.
N plus 1, very good. But why do we do the plus 1?
That's a very good question.
Oh, okay.
Does it account for the year that you got that 500,000?
Yeah. So remember that with the net income, we've got years 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But here we've got year 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So there are actually 6 different book value amounts that we're adding together. So to get the average, what are we going to do? We're going to divide by 6. And so his instinct was correct, and that is that you're always going to have one more year on your book value denominator than you do on your earnings denominator. Okay, now I want to point something out to you. Notice that the average investment is exactly 1/2 of the initial investment. If you straight line depreciate something to zero over its life, the average book value will always be 1/2 the initial investment. Let me say that again. If you straight line depreciate something to zero, straight line depreciation, we just took that 500,000 divided by 5 and got $100,000 a year. If we straight line depreciate it to zero, then your average book value is going to be exactly 1/2 of the initial investment. It's going to be exactly 1/2 of the initial investment. And you will see on one of the examples or on a problem where on the bottom, instead of doing this for the denominator, they will simply take 500,000 divided by 2. And that's exactly why. Because if you straight line depreciate to zero, you always get an average investment of the initial cost divided by 2. I could draw you a picture here on the board and kind of prove it, but
You said 1/2 of the what?
1/2 of the initial investment. Initial investment. In this case, $500,000 we invested into this machine up front. And then we looked at how we depreciate this over its lifetime. We take it all the way down to zero. If we do that, it turns out that the average investment, the average book value, is exactly 1/2 the initial investment. Okay, so now I've got those two numbers. I've got 50,000 on top, I've got 250,000 on the bottom, and that gives me a 20% AAR. Now, how do we know whether that's good or bad? Well, let me throw some arbitrary cutoffs at you. If the average accounting return arbitrary cutoff is 15%, do we accept the project? Yes. If it's 25%, do we accept the project? No, we reject it because our AAR is less than the arbitrary cutoff. But what if it's exactly 20%? Do we accept or reject? Yeah, we accept it because the rule is we accept anything with an average accounting return greater than or equal to the arbitrary cutoff. Now they make a good point down here. Look at the taxes. Taxes in the beginning are positive, but at the end we have negative $16,667. If this were a standalone project, this would not be good. And here's why. Do you think when you lose money, the government mails you a check for being a loser?
I wish.
You wish, right? But at least in corporate taxes, that's not the way it works. Corporate taxes, that's not the way it works. Now, if we had any accountants in here, they would tell us about tax loss carry forwards, and that's legit. But here's what we're going to assume. We're going to assume that this project is part of a larger, profitable organization, and that any negative taxes we have in this project will serve merely to reduce the positive taxes we owe on the rest of our stuff. Does that make sense? So in essence, what we're assuming here is that we're going to owe more than $16,667 in taxes elsewhere in the company, and so it's perfectly fine to still go ahead and have a negative tax here. We're going to be doing that throughout our capital budgeting. It's always going to be an assumption that this is part of a larger, profitable company. Okay, questions? Now let's talk about AAR and our 3 questions. Number 1, does it account for the time value of money? No. In fact, if you look, when we threw those net incomes in there and added them all together, divided by 5, did we give any more weight to the first one than the last one? No. Number 2, does it account for the riskiness of the cash flows? I don't think so. Accountants will argue, they'll say, well, wait a minute, we would ask for a higher arbitrary cutoff for riskier projects. And I say, that's great. What sort of scientific basis did you come up with for determining that? And they would say, right? Because there is no scientific basis. Unlike what we did in chapter 12, where we used the markets as a laboratory to figure out how to price risk, accountants can't do that. And so number 2 is also a no. Number 3, does it provide information regarding the wealth created by the project? No, it's not even using real cash flows, right?
So the first one is no, then all have to be no. Because there was not one.
I think you're right.
Yeah, because there was not one where we had yes, no, yes, or yes, no, yes, yes, or something.
Yeah.
So it's just, if it was yes for the first one, it was yes for all.
Yeah, I like that. Very good. Okay, and then also, if the first one is there, then it kind of has to do the second one, right?
Mm-hmm.
Except for we'll see one where it's, if we missed one of the ingredients, we wouldn't have that, but we'll get there.
Yeah.
Good thought. Any other thoughts? Okay, so how many stars are we going to give this thing? 0. So, people still use this. Why would they? And the answers are, numbers are readily available and people are lazy. Now, when I say readily available, what do I mean? Accounting numbers, organizations have accounting numbers to begin with. And let me tell you about my accountant, Jack Heffelfinger, his real name, Jack Heffelfinger. Jack was the only guy in the business unit that had his own office. The rest of us all were in with like some other social creature. And Jack was also the only person who didn't have a window. So it was like a cave in there with the zombie lights and whatnot. And Jack would be sitting there with his computer looking sad and lonely. And you'd go by and you'd say, hey, Jack. He'd look up and I'd say, I need some numbers. And this is what Jack would do, right? This is what he lives for. So I tell him kind of what we were doing. He's like, oh yeah. He cranks up his spreadsheet. He starts doing stuff. And he's just the happiest I've seen him in weeks, right? I'm lazy. Jack will come up with the numbers for me. It's all good. So that's number 1. By the way, is that a good reason? Absolutely not. Number 2, it's easy to calculate. Did we need time value of money to do this? No. And now, by the way, easy to calculate. We did that with Payback, and we said it's one of the advantages of Payback, and it's perhaps an advantage here. Where we start to really see something that might possibly have meaning is the 3rd bullet point, and that is that stockholders and media pay attention to accounting returns, ROE and ROA. If you listen to watch CNBC, you'll hear them talk about ROE and ROA. And average accounting return is related to ROA. In fact, it's kind of like the ROA for the project because that top part is net income and the bottom part is the assets, right? And so this is basically an ROA for the project. And you might think, aha, if I just accept projects with ROAs or with AAR greater than the company's ROA, it's going to be good for the company because the ROA is going to go up, up, up. And that would all be fine and good except for one thing. We haven't talked about the riskiness of those projects. So for instance, you could have a project like building the Nissan Altima plant that might have an ROA of 9%. And then you've got something riskier, like a Nissan that goes to space. And you might have a higher ROA on that. But is that return enough to compensate for the risk? We just don't know. And so this argument starts to have merit, but then we figure out that it's really not good. Now, then finally, my favorite, sometimes your boss is an accountant. Sometimes your boss is an accountant. We had this guy that came to Halliburton from our accountant, the Houston office of Arthur Anderson, which by the way brought you the Enron problem, right? Same group. And he came to Halliburton, and my boss told me, he says, you keep an eye on that guy. He's got a rocket in his ass. What did he mean? It's nothing sexual.
He's harsh.
Rocket, what's a rocket do? Yeah, he's gonna climb quickly. And by the way, this use of ass is naughty, right? Okay, so he says, he's got a rocket, and sure enough, this guy within just a handful of years was the CEO. Once he became CEO, guess what? We started having to produce average accounting return. Why? Because your boss is an accountant. Now, let me tell you how to deal with that. Your boss comes to you and says, I'm going to pick on Ms. Minahan. Your boss says, Ms. Minahan, I need you to run an analysis on buying this machine. If the average accounting return is greater than 20%, we're going to accept, or is greater than or equal to, we're going to accept the project. And she says, okay. Now, here's what she should do. She should go off and do exactly as she was told. Calculate the AAR. But what else do you think she should do? Yeah, she should also calculate NPV. And if the NPV is positive and the AAR is greater than 20%, she goes back and says, boss, you're a genius. Greater than 20%, let's do it. If the AAR is less than 20% and the NPV is negative, once again, they agree, reject the project. Then she says, oh, boss, I'm sorry. That's a bad idea. The AAR is only 17%. The boss could say, okay, well, whatever. And then you move on. What happens when these things disagree? The worst can be that the AAR says to accept and NPV says to reject. How do you handle that? You go to your boss and you say, boss, AAR for this project is 21%, which is greater than the cutoff that you gave me. However, just to be sure, I ran NPV and the NPV is actually negative. This is going to destroy shareholder wealth. And your boss says, AAR greater than 20%, we're going for it. What do you do? Yes, sir, right? And then you go back to your desk. By the way, it would be different today. I'm telling you this story from a 1997 perspective. Today, you'd get out your phone and you type yourself a note. Back then, we had a logbook. Whenever one of my employees was naughty, I would write down that they were naughty. And then if I was told to do something stupid or illegal, I would write that down too, right? They never asked me to do anything illegal at that company. Okay, oh no, I can take that back. There was that accounting fraud. Okay, back to the story. What am I gonna do? I'm gonna go to my desk and I'm gonna write down, today, Bob asked me, and I'm gonna write down all the specifics. I'm gonna say, I told him this is a negative NPV project. He said we're gonna do it anyway. I put it in my desk drawer, I shut the drawer, and I forget about it. Until the investigation. By the way, whose name is on the paperwork? Mine. They're like, Haggard, look at this. You signed off on this thing. What the hell? And then I say, wait just a minute. And I get out my logbook, and it's like kindergarten where I read to the students, right? And I read the whole thing to them, and I say, Would you like me to go burn a copy of that for you on the Xerox machine? And undoubtedly they're going to say yes, so I'm going to do that. Now, what do you think happens then? I'm in the clear, right? What about Bob? Yeah, Bob may get axed. And then as a bonus, who may get Bob's job? Does that make sense? Okay. Now, when I told you when you not to argue because it's negative NPV, there are a lot of cases where it's better to be employed than to be right? So little things like this when we're talking about the shareholders losing a few $1,000 because your boss is making a bad decision, is it worth you getting into a fight and losing your job over? Not really. When is it worth you getting into a fight and losing your job over? If safety is at hand, if there's fraud involved. Does that make sense? Then it's perfectly fine for you to, and of course you got to be prepared to lose your job, right? Okay, questions? Now let's talk about the internal rate of return, or IRR. So this is a definition you should have on your note sheet. This is a definition you should have on your note sheet. This is a definition you should have on your note sheet. IRR is the discount rate that makes the net present value of a project 0. IRR is the discount rate that makes the net present value of your project equal to 0. And our rule is this: we're going to accept all projects with IRR greater than the appropriate discount rate. And by the way, that's exactly the same discount rate we would be using for NPV. That's exactly the same interest rate or discount rate we're going to be using for NPV. And so if, and there are going to be some conditions on this, but typically if IRR is greater than that appropriate discount rate, then it will be a positive NPV project. Now we're going to show you some examples where that's not quite true, but this is generally true. If the IRR is greater than the appropriate discount rate, then NPV is greater than 0 and we should accept it. So what do we need for IRR? Well, we need the initial investment amount, we need the future cash flows and their timing, and we need the discount rate appropriate to the risk of the future cash flows. That looks exactly like what we needed for NPV. Does that look familiar? Okay, now, am I going to tell you that this is Meatloaf? The answer is no. We're going to see that it's got usefulness beyond, it's got usefulness unlike discounted payback, which really doesn't have any usefulness. Questions so far? Okay, now here's a simple example. You've got an investment that's going to pay $110 1 year from today, and the investment is $100 today. What's the IRR? Well, we set up our NPV formula. We've got that initial investment of 100, that's why it's got a minus sign on it, plus the present value of the future cash flows. In this case, there's only one. 110 divided by 1 plus R to the first, and we can set all that up and solve for R. And it's easy enough to see that the required, or that this rate of return is 10%. And you say, wow, that's pretty easy. We wouldn't even need a calculator for that. But here's the problem. That example was simple. It was easy to solve because there was only one R. Let's think about what it would look like if there was more than 1 year's worth of cash flows. It would be our NPV, which we're saying must be 0. And it's going to be negative cash flow at time 0 plus cash flow at time 1 divided by 1 plus R plus the cash flow at time 2 divided by 1 plus R, what's the exponent here? Squared. Plus C03 divided by 1 plus R cubed plus plus C0n divided by 1 plus R to the n. I'm using the same nomenclature as your CF on your calculator here. Okay, now, I know that none of you are high-end mathematicians from my experiences so far here. So you're just gonna have to take my word for it that you cannot solve this thing for R. At least not in any way that I know. And I've had, 13 hours of calculus and 3 hours of differential equations, and I still can't do this, right? So, what am I telling you? There's really only one way to solve this, and it's through a process called iteration. Iteration means repeated guessing. So I'm gonna guess an R here. And if my R is too low, then the present values of all these cash flows will be too high, and this thing will be positive, not zero. And if my R is too high, then these present value figures will be too low, and this thing will come out negative. And so I can keep tweaking back and forth until I get reasonably close to zero, and then I can call that my IRR. Now, that sounds terrible, and I can tell you from experience that it is, because in engineering school, in a class called heat transfer, this is exactly what we had to do. We had to iterate, we had to guess. The good news is, though, you don't, because you've got your TI BA2+, and it will do the guessing for you. So go ahead and get your calculator out. And we're gonna start by clearing out our cash flow register, CF, second, clear work. An investment of $200 today gets you $100 per year for the next 3 years. What's the IRR? So we're gonna put in 200 negative, enter, arrow down. What should I put in for C01? 100. And it's gotta be positive. Enter, arrow down. Why is F01 3? Yeah, you got 3 identical cash flows in a row, right? So that's all we've got to do. Now, this next question is excruciatingly hard. What button would I hit next to calculate IRR? Oh!
IRR.
I think we're going to go with IRR. Now, it says IRR 0. Do you think that's correct?
No.
No.
Oh, now you can confirm.
Yeah, now we hit compute. And where's your clue? Look up at the top. What's it say?
Compute.
Compute. So there we go, 23.375%. If the appropriate discount rate were 20%, we would accept that project. If the appropriate discount rate were 25%, we would reject it.
I have a question. For cash flow problems that we've done before, we have had reoccurring like costs. We've only just used one. What is the difference between using like the 3 for F01 and just a 1 and repeating?
Okay, well, first of all, we have used more than 1 for F before. Maybe you weren't here that day. But secondly, let's say that this cash flow went on for 30 years. Would you like to type in C01 equals 100, C02 is equal 100 all the way up to C30? No, of course not. That's why. Good question. Other questions?
It's the same process if you have different cash flows for year 2 and 3. Like you would go down to CO2 for those.
Oh, yeah,
same
yeah.
thing.
Yeah, anytime that the amount of the cash flow changes, we have to enter a new C0 whatever, and then put in the appropriate number of repeats. And let me tell you this, in the real world, it's very difficult to find a project that's being done correctly that the cash flows will be the same. The ones where we see that, where it actually truly repeats, those are simple problems. So I'll give you an example. If you buy a machine, in the first year, probably not a lot of maintenance. Second year, start to get some maintenance. Third year, more maintenance, right? And so when you're subtracting out that maintenance cost, it means that your positive cash flow from that's probably going to go down over time. Other things might change too, like the number of units per year that you're gonna sell. So for instance, when they started off selling Pokemon crap, in the beginning, do you think they sold a lot of Pokemon crap? No. But then, things take off. Does that make sense? Okay. Let's see. Oh, and and of course, if you're a nerd, you can sit there and stare at your calculator and see how long it takes. If you're calculating NPV, you will see that it's like that on your calculator. But if you do IRR, you'll see that it sits there and thinks for a while. It's doing the repeated guessing. It's doing the repeated guessing. So I do want to show you one more thing here. Let's get our calculator back up. Work me. I'm going to store 1. I'm going to hit clear. Now I'm going to hit NPV, and I'm going to hit recall 1. Enter, arrow down, and I'm going to compute NPV. What should it be? 0. 1.28 times 10 to the negative 11th. This is called scientific notation. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with scientific notation, here's what it looks like. This is 0.00000000000. 1 blah 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 blah. Keep in mind the point of 1 would be 1 cent. I'm all the way down here. 1 cent's way up there, right? That would be 1 times 10 to the negative 8. This is 1 times 10 to the negative 11th. Can we agree that this is actually just 0? Yeah. Questions? Okay. Does IRR account for the time value of money?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So hold on. She's always wanting to get ahead. Okay. So here's how we're accounting for that time value of money. 1 plus R, 1 plus R to the second, and so forth. So find the present value of those things. Number 2, does it account for the riskiness of the cash flows?
Yeah.
Yes. How? Once again, the instincts are good.
I mean, we use cash flows, so.
You can use cash flows and payback and you don't have.
That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
Just rebel.
I'm not sure.
Let me ask you this. What's the rule for accepting and rejecting IRR?
Just do the discount rate.
Yeah, we're only accepting if it's greater than that discount rate. The discount rate is related to the, oh, come on, a minute ahead. The risk, right? So that's how we're accounting for risk here. So far so good. 2 yeses. Does it provide information regarding the wealth created by the project? Ms. Roll says yes. Mr.
No, I'm
Winters?
saying no now.
Oh, you're saying no now? Okay, does anyone else want to take the yes position? No, okay. I would actually accept either answer here. And here's why. It does tell you whether or not you're creating wealth. If IRR greater than the discount rate, then, assuming things aren't weird, we are creating shareholder wealth. But do we know how much? Not really. We only know whether we are creating or destroying. We don't know our dollars and cents value. And so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give this thing 2.5 stars. 2.5 stars. It's not quite 3 stars like NPV, but it's certainly better than a lot of the other stuff that we're going to look at. We're only going to have one other measure that comes up to 2.5 stars. Questions? Okay, I will see you guys next time.